Budget battle. President Trump meets with Republicans over the possible government shutdown and the border wall. Doubling down as the president defends his decision to remove U.S. troops from Syria, why some allies are questioning the move. Sacred spaces. The Vatican issues guidelines on what to do with the growing number of churches that are closing. And Season's Greeting will explain why some people's Christmas plans are up in the air. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, December 20th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Capitol Hill confusion. Parts of the government face a shutdown tomorrow night. President Trump now says he's not on board with a spending bill that already passed the Senate. It's needed to keep the government open. The president wants billions of dollars more for security at the Mexican border. Correspondent Jason Calvi is on Capitol Hill. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. Key House Republicans held an emergency meeting with the president. President Trump tells them he will not sign the Senate-passed bill. That means the government could shut down tomorrow night, just 3 days before Christmas. Tonight, the House goes back to the drawing board.
The president informed us that he will not sign the bill that came over from the Senate last evening because of his legitimate concerns for border security.
The Senate last night passed that bill to keep the government open through February 8th.
The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
But not agreed to by the commander-in-chief.
The president said what the Senate sent over is just kicking the can down the road. We want to solve this problem. We want to make sure we keep the government open, and we're going to work to have that done and get something happening.
Some conservative House Republicans urged President Trump to demand more money for the wall. They said it's better to fight for that money now rather than when they lose the House in January.
Look, we're going to try to get as much as we can to fulfill the president's agenda, and every indication that he gives us that he's going to have our back only gives us more of an appetite to fight.
So what's going to happen tonight?
I don't know.
Uncertainty if Congress and the White House can agree on a spending bill to keep the government open.
Is the government going to shut down tomorrow night?
I doubt it, but stay tuned. I don't know for sure. I do think that we should have provided the funding for additional border security that the president wanted, and that still remains to be seen in the House.
And with those questions, Democrats take aim.
Republicans are in a state of disarray. We don't know what will happen next. In terms of wall funding, that's a non-starter. I think they know that.
So maybe that's why Speaker Ryan outside the White House did not refer to a border wall. Instead, he said the president wants billions more to secure the border. We may see broader language like this around border security in order to get votes from Democrats needed for passage. Wyatt?
Jason, if the funding runs out tomorrow night, what happens?
More than 800,000 federal workers would face furloughs or work without pay. For dozens of government agencies, plus the national parks and forests, funding runs out as the clock strikes midnight tomorrow night.
I have a feeling it's going to be very frantic there tonight and tomorrow. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thanks, Jason. The United States says asylum-seeking migrants will have to wait in Mexico until their claims are processed. The agreement between the countries will affect tens of thousands of people each month. Less than 10% of people are granted asylum. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen says the refugees will not be able to, quote, disappear into the United States. President Donald Trump defends his decision to pull all 2,000 U.S. troops out of Syria. He says it should come as no surprise since he's been campaigning on it for years. But advocates worry about Syria's vulnerable citizens, including Christians who are left behind. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Vulnerable Christians could face more challenges after President Trump declared victory over ISIS in Syria. He released a video saying it's time to welcome U.S. troops home.
We have won against ISIS.
President Trump says U.S. troops have been in Syria long enough, and it's time for countries in the region to finish the fight. He tweets, Russia, Iran, Syria, and many others are not happy about the U.S. leaving, despite what the fake news says. Because now they will have to fight ISIS and others who they hate without us. I am building by far the most powerful military in the world. ISIS hits us, they are doomed. Some question if a U.S. exit will increase instability in the region, with Syria still experiencing civil war.
To be safe,
Edward Clancy with the nonprofit organization Aid to the Church in Need thinks it could worsen the plight of Christians.
Christians will be stuck in the middle. They'll be, put in the wheels of the grinder, so to speak. And that's my real concern. And that's why I hope that this is done wisely. It's not done just for some political pressure.
Clancy remembers when the U.S. removed military forces from Iraq. ISIS moved in, and Clancy says terrorists persecuted Christians. More than 70% were uprooted and forced to flee their ancestral homelands.
Be ready to respond, because we saw in Iraq that things got bad very quickly.
Some of the greatest concerns over the president's longtime pledge to remove the troops are coming from members of his own party.
The decision to withdraw an American presence in Syria is a colossal, in my mind, mistake, a grave error that's going to have significant repercussions in the years and months to come.
If you're tired of fighting radical Islam, I understand it. They're not tired of fighting you. And if you don't get that, you're making a huge mistake.
Senator Lindsey Graham says he hopes and prays the president will reconsider. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders issued a statement saying the U.S. will continue to fight terrorists and prevent them from, quote, infiltrating our borders. Wyatt?
Mark, how is the U.S. troop withdrawal viewed by Russia, another country with big stake in Syria?
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin agrees with President Trump's victory proclamation. Putin says we have beaten the forces in Syria. Now, the U.S. pullout could strengthen Russia's role in Syria. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. And joining me now for more analysis is Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Okay, Matthew, so we just heard Senator Marco Rubio, who says that this move is a colossal mistake. What's your take, and what do you think this impact will have on the region?
Well, I think the senator makes a good argument. The first point to make is the war on ISIS is not actually finished. We have degraded ISIS. We have not defeated it. It even still controls a small pocket of territory in eastern Syria. So this withdrawal, of course, would be leaving the battlefield before the battle is won. The second reason is that this mission in eastern Syria has actually been relatively low cost and high yield, because not only do we have boots on the ground to help with the war on ISIS, we're also protecting the main ground force against ISIS, which are the Kurds, and we're there establishing forward presence, and that deters actions, bad actions, by actors like Iran, Syria, Russia, and then Turkey. So we remove that, and then of course there's a humanitarian cost. We discussed the Christians, we just mentioned the Kurds as well. It also sends, I think, a bad signal to our allies. President Trump enforced Barack Obama's red line, right? And I think that kind of sent a message to our allies that said you can trust America now. If we leave before the mission is done in Syria, I think not only our allies are going to be nervous, but our adversaries in the region are going to start looking to build off this opportunity.
Okay, so we'll be watching that situation. I want to switch gears here. In other news, conservatives are also urging the president to reject a stopgap funding measure unless, of course, it includes border wall funding. Do you think the president's been convinced by them from other conservatives, or this is his own decision?
No, I think the president saw the reaction among his conservative base to this prospect of not being able to secure wall funding in this end-of-the-year appropriation. He saw how furious conservatives were, and so that's why he told the House leadership that he needs a bill that has some money for the wall. The problem, though, isn't necessarily in the House. The problem is in the Senate, where you need 60 votes to get that appropriations bill past the finish line. And I'm just not sure who holds the leverage here. Typically, the party that's blamed for the government shutdown is the one that doesn't want the government shutdown. But President Trump, in his meeting the other week with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, said, go ahead, blame me for the shutdown. He's willing to take that blame, which means that we might have a shutdown in the coming days.
Okay, well, we watch to see how all that plays out, especially within the next 48 hours. So while we're waiting to see what happens with that, I want to ask you about Mexico, because we also have the story about Mexico and the agreement to keep immigrants who want asylum in their country. Do you think this is enough to appease the president's base, who's looking to see progress on immigration reform?
Oh, I think this policy will be welcomed by President Trump's base. I mean, the fact is we have had people exploiting loopholes in our asylum law for some time, and that's one of the drivers of the migrant caravans that have been causing such commotion on our border throughout this past year. So this agreement with Mexico, which would require asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their process is being claimed, their claim is being processed rather, will do a lot, I think, to solve the problem. Because what happens typically is they enter the country illegally, they make the claim for asylum, and while their claim is being adjudicated, they disappear and they become illegal immigrants. So in this case, they'll have to remain in Mexico. I think it will cut down on illegal immigration.
Okay, so many important issues to discuss. We'll be watching all of them. Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
The Attorney General of Illinois issues a blistering report about clergy sex abuse.
We've just been shocked to learn that there are, in addition to the now over 85 publicly released names where there have been credible allegations against clergy members for abusing or assaulting minors, there are another 500 where there are allegations.
The Illinois disclosures are a new blow to the church. The Archdiocese of Chicago has published a statement saying all allegations of child sex abuse have been reported to civil authorities and investigated. Jesuit leaders say no priest credibly accused of sexually abusing a minor will be sent to Gonzaga University. A report this week said at least 20 clergy members facing allegations were allowed to live at the campus in Washington State. The revelation comes amid a global sex abuse crisis in the church. Russian President Vladimir Putin accuses Ukraine of meddling in the Orthodox Church.
Не нравится московского прихода, будь стамбульского прихода.
He says the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's recent split from the Russian Church after more than 300 years defies logic and is the result of interference from political leaders. Egypt says security forces have killed 8 militants who planned attacks on Christians during the Christmas season. Officials say they detained 4 other suspects. The 12 belong to an armed faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. Madagascar is counting votes in its runoff presidential election. Polls closed yesterday after a mostly peaceful voting. 2 former leaders of the Indian Ocean island are vying to return to power. More than 2/3 of the country's 25 million people live in extreme poverty. The Vatican is addressing the question of how to handle the growing number of closed churches and sacred places. Mass attendance continues to decline. Experts say hundreds of churches in Western Europe have closed in the last 2 decades. In the United States, the number of parishes has fallen sharply over the same time period. That's according to Georgetown University's Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley joins us from Rome. Juliet, what is the problem and how is the Vatican addressing it?
Wyatt, late last month, the Vatican brought together bishops and experts to study this very issue. And according to one Vatican expert who spoke about this, since the year 2000, more than 500 Catholic churches have closed in Germany, a third of which were demolished, and the remainder was sold or used for other purposes. So the question is, what are best practices to deal with these sacred spaces? Now, the church says it's best not to sell these churches, but to use them for charitable, social, or even pastoral purposes. So, for instance, a Vatican official tells me that ideally decommissioned churches should be used as soup kitchens, as schools, or as medical clinics for the poor, for instance. Now, what church leaders definitely don't want is for a church to become a bar, a grocery store, or even a pizzeria. The idea is that churches shouldn't be used for commercial uses.
So then how will these points be enforced?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. These are just recommendations. They're not enforceable by church law, but 11 guidelines came out of the meeting of delegates from 23 countries that gathered in Rome at the end of November. And those delegates were from European countries, from North America, and from Australia, the countries that are hardest hit by secularism. And a Vatican official tells me they hope that the bishops' conferences will follow these recommendations. At the end of the day, Wyatt, bishops have the ultimate say on what happens to churches that are no longer in use.
According to research by Georgetown University, the number of parishes in the United States fell sharply between the year 2000 and 2007, a drop of about 2,000. What is the decline due to, and what extent is it linked to the sex abuse crisis?
Certainly, Wyatt, in the United States, as in Western countries in general, secularism has greatly affected church attendance as well as clergy numbers. And there is also the issue of diocesan funds drying up due to sex abuse claims, particularly affecting American dioceses. So the fact of the matter is that the decommissioning of churches is happening at a rapid rate, but critics say the church should focus more on bringing people back to church rather than what to do with closed churches. Pope Francis told participants in this conference that closing churches must not be the first and only solution to be considered, and that these sacred spaces are a tool of evangelization.
All very important issues that the Vatican is dealing with right now. Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, how a parable from the Bible can deepen our relationship with God. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. In this season of Advent, a new book reminds the faithful that we are called to know and love God. God's Search for Us, 5 Truths from a Missing Coin, examines how the parable of the missing coin can help us deepen our relationship with Jesus Christ. Lauren Ashburn sat down with the author, Father Jeffrey Kirby, last week.
Father Jeffrey Kirby, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you, Lauren.
How does the parable of the lost coin help us understand ways that God is searching for us?
Yeah, so this parable is told by the Lord in Luke chapter 15. Woman searching for this coin, searching for this coin. And that parable, that simple parable, encapsulates, and the Lord's teaching us this, God's constant search for us. So this is a Judeo-Christian belief that is at the very core of what we believe, how we understand God, that long before we search for Him, He's looking for us. He's searching. He's moving stuff around. He's lighting lamps. He's sweeping.
Yoo-hoo,
yeah,
yoo-hoo.
right, exactly.
Where are you?
Exactly. Come on, come on.
Come
exactly.
on.
Yes. Exactly.
I think most people assume that we are searching for God, right? Catholic program, we're here, we want to find God, we want to give God's word, but they don't assume God's searching for us.
Exactly, and that's certainly the contemporary push, is our search for God. I'm looking for God, I'm searching for meaning, I'm looking for myself, and so on. And these can all be noble pursuits, but if we don't realize that God's first searching for us, then they really have no substance or purpose, right? Because God is looking for us. By realizing He's searching for us, we then reciprocate and say, well, I also need you, Lord. I want to know you. I desire to see your face, in biblical language.
There's a book called A Friendship Like No Other, and it talks about the friendship between you and Jesus, but that Jesus needs you as much as He needs as the other way around.
Yes, yes,
right?
exactly. It's a reciprocal relationship that, we speak that the Lord truly wants a friendship. Like, He wants a friendship. Like, an authentic friendship is reciprocal. Like, we give and we receive in generosity.
You write about how in today's world, society attempts to silence, shame, privatize, and trivialize Christian beliefs, practices, and influence. How do we combat that?
Yes, yeah, we give stronger witness. I mean, whenever we can find ourselves getting overwhelmed, we just look at our early forefathers and foremothers. Like, when the gospel was first announced, it was in a pagan world that believed that gods dictated everything and they were out to get us and hurt us. It was a dark environment full of despair. And the good news was proclaimed as light, and it changed the world. And it can continue to change the world, can change our lives.
I have children, and we usually watch the show, so hi kids. And I'm working on teaching them that popular culture isn't always to be believed or followed, and that it's really all about your faith.
Yes, absolutely.
That's hard. That's a hard message in this world.
It is, and we have to allow, it's like, do our feelings determine our beliefs, or are we going to allow our beliefs to mature our feelings? And when religion becomes a sentiment, we lose it, because we just are projecting ourselves. But
Explain that.
Sure, so that if it's just my feelings, well, Jesus should be this way, Jesus should be that way. Well, eventually what I've created is a counterfeit Christ, someone that is not authentically Jesus, according to the Scriptures. So really I've just projected what I want onto this other figure.
This image of God.
Exactly.
Right.
Biblically,
as opposed to searching for what God truly is.
Absolutely, and allowing Him to change us and so on. And for us to create this, I mean, biblically, that's our definition of idolatry. That I want something other than the true God. But if I encounter the true God, then I let Him change me, right? And His grace can.
This has been a tough year for the church. How do you think this book can help Catholics Stay true. Stay in the
Yes.
boat.
Right, exactly. Yes, I know there's a lot of heaviness with the church, and I'd say that if we return to our core, if we go back to the good news, then that message that, allowed the church to grow in spite of Judas can allow the church to continue to grow in spite of bad bishops, bad priests, in spite of scandals, because it's good news. We were made for this, and the more we announce it with boldness and joy, the more people will be convinced, and the greater good it can do.
Father Jeffrey Kirby, thank you so much. Author of God's Search for Us.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.
And our thanks to Lauren Ashburn and Father Jeffrey Kirby. Officials at a Catholic church in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, say the city has forced them to remove a nativity scene display on public property. The parish priest at St. Edmund is challenging the decision. The city says it has a new policy on such displays and wants all religions represented. For more on the story, including a look at the laws governing religious displays on public property, visit the National Catholic Register at ncregister.com. Up next, the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See attends a screening of an EWTN documentary. And meet two people who are floating through the holidays.
Il momento che tutto cambia, tutto, dalla radice.
Pope Francis says the Annunciation changed history. At his daily Mass this morning, the Holy Father said the God of surprises changed our destiny through the birth of his Son, adding nothing is impossible for God. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Outgoing Tennessee Representative Diane Black, a pro-life leader, has advice for the pro-life movement as she prepares to leave Washington.
Never, never, never give up. You cannot give up. This is all in God's hands after all, and he just calls us to do his work. And so don't ever give up and say, because I wasn't successful, that it's not something that you will be eventually successful in God's time.
You can see more of Katherine Hadrow's interview tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN. On Saturday, EWTN will air an original movie on the life of Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini, the first American saint. Today, the film was screened in the Vatican.
Our most powerful weapon is not money, but the limitless trust in the heart of Jesus.
Mother Cabrini overcame numerous obstacles and founded nearly 70 schools, orphanages, and hospitals in the United States and around the world. Among those in attendance, Callista Gingrich, the U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. You can see the film on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on EWTN. Saturday is the 101st anniversary of her death. And finally tonight, two people who traveled a long way this Christmas without hitting any traffic. These astronauts aboard the International Space Station are celebrating Christmas with red shirts, Santa Claus hats, and even an elf on a really high shelf. It's the idea of American Anne McLean. She's wearing the red hat in the video. McLean is sending elf on a shelf photos to her son via social media. Her colleagues on the space station are also celebrating Christmas from Russia and Canada. Nice to see the celebration of Christ's birth extends even beyond our planet. Well, that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.